Hi, my name's Mark Downs. Today we're on the banks of Lough Erne in Northern Ireland. In fact, we're in the grounds of the Manor Hotel just outside Enniskillen. What a beautiful setting for a day's pleasure fishing. Today we're going to try our hand at catching a few fish on probably one of the most popular methods used in England today, the swim feeder. A little bit of luck, we'll catch ourselves a few roach and a few bream. If all things goes well, we could have some fairly nice sized fish. If you're looking into the distance, you'll see some lovely landing stages. They look very nice, but the problem is at this time of year, early spring, a little bit too shallow. A little bit further up the bank where we are here, it drops off and it's quite deep. And just before all the fish start to move in for spawning, they tend to congregate here. With a little bit of luck, we'll catch some nice fish. It's a lovely looking setting. I'm guaranteed if the weather holds, we should have a good day's fishing. Let's drop my tackle off and let's get started. The amazing thing about Lough Erne is that everywhere you sit on the loch, the outlook is different. Like today, I've got big rolling hills in the distance. At the far end of the loch here, there's a lovely wooded area. We've even got the lovely marina. If you fancy a holiday cruising, that's the place to go. It twists, it turns, it goes round corners. In actual fact, that far bank in front of us there, it looks like the far bank. In fact, it's a great big island, only accessible with a boat, obviously. If you go around that island for about a mile or so, you come to the Trewry. Now, I fish Trewry on dozens and dozens of occasions. It's full of fish. You get fish there, hybrids, 2–2.5 pound a piece, fabulous day sport. But I've selected this particular venue today because, to be honest, you can catch fish all the year round. In the summer, when the fish have actually moved in to spawn onto the shallows, those landing stages are absolutely perfect. Because we're fishing early spring, the fish are just in the deeps at the moment, just edging to get onto those shallows and spawn. As I mentioned, it drops off quite deeply here, and all those fish are channeling through at the moment, eager to get onto the spawning beds, where in 2 or 3 years' time there's absolutely millions and millions of small fish. And unbelievably, they just disappear into the loch for year after year. But every 4 or 5 years they all come back in the thousands, and the fishing is unbelievable. I don't think we're going to catch a fantastic bag of fish today, but I guarantee we're going to catch something. And the method, as I mentioned again, is the swim feeder. 6 or 7 years ago, the swim feeder really came of age. It's taken anglers at least 9 or 10 years to get used to using the method. When it was first invented, I don't know exactly how long it was invented, probably 20–25 years ago, it was a very, very crude method. In fact, the anglers on the River Severn, believe it or not, used to use great big Coca-Cola tins with holes drilled in them, filled with maggots and thrown down the middle. I'm glad to say we've become far more sophisticated than that nowadays. In fact, there are many, many anglers in England that specialise on swim feeder fishing. Also, it's been a godsend to the pleasure angler. Fish that were normally inaccessible are now freely caught with the swim feeder. And I can safely say if ever a method enhanced the sport, the swim feeder's just done that. You go to any local tackle shop. Now, it used to, well, 5 or 6 years ago, you used to have a big range of floats, just 3 or 4 different types of swim feeders. But nowadays, there are dozens and dozens of different manufacturers that manufacture swim feeders, all shapes, sizes, all for specific reasons. If I was fishing this particular peg 7 or 8 years ago, I'd probably come with one swim feeder. It would have been a simple plastic swim feeder with 2 caps on the end, and I would just throw it in and hope for the best. But today I've come more prepared. I've got at least 7 or 8 different swim feeders, and if the wind gets up, I'll change the swim feeder. If it drops, I'll change the swim feeder again if the flow picks up, just like float fishing, so many combinations. Let's have a look at a few specific swim feeders now. I've got probably a dozen or so in this box. As I mentioned earlier, they're all designed for specific reasons. The swim feeder I'll be using today, let's drop that down. First of all, that is a standard open-end swim feeder. The makeup is quite simple. It's a plastic tube with a few holes punched into it and a very thin strip of lead down the side. Notice I mentioned lead. Lead is in fact legal, providing it's an integral part of the swim feeder. So don't worry about non-leaded swim feeders. At the end of the lead, we have this little plastic sleeve which we attach the line. And you're thinking to yourself, well, how does he get his bait into that? Well, it's quite simple. We just plug it with ground bait. Ground bait, the bread constituents actually bind themselves into the swim feeder. We then cast it into the lake itself. When it settles on the bottom, fizzes, bubbles, all the bait comes out, fish come in, not only they eat the bait around your swim feeder, they also take the bait and the hook bait on your hook. That's the first swim feeder we'll be using today. The second type of swim feeder we'll be using today is a block end swim feeder. The one end is in fact fixed, but the second end actually comes off, whereby we actually fill with bait. And like the open end swim feeder, it has some weight down one side, but in this particular case we only fill it with loose feed. In other words, you actually put maggots or casters into the feeder itself. We normally use these swim feeders when we're fishing for roach, because I'm of the opinion that the majority of roach would rather feed on hook baits themselves rather than mess about eating the ground bait. The development of this swim feeder came from that Coca-Cola tin, and all different sizes and shapes of these feeders are now available on the marketplace. In fact, you can get jumbo feeders about 3.5 inches long, inch and a quarter inch wide, which probably take an eighth of a pint of maggots. We won't be using one of those today for the simple reason, well, we're on our own, there's no need to draw fish from anybody else, so any fish out there are only going to be ours. You might notice on this particular swim feeder, I've wrapped an extra little bit of lead around the weight itself. In fact, most of the swim feeders I do buy are modified to some extent, simply because every time you go swim feeder fishing, the requirements are slightly different. Now, I wrapped this particular bit of lead around for a match I fished on the River Trent just before the season finished back in March. And the reason being was the weight on the swim feeder itself was just insufficient to actually locate the feeder on the bottom like so. In other words, the current was picking the feeder up and bouncing it along like so. Well, after 10 or 15 minutes that was okay, because all I was really doing was just feeding the peg with bait. But when I actually wanted to locate it on the bottom permanently, I had to add that little extra strip of lead, and that was perfect. On that particular I ended up with 26 pounds. Going back, albeit briefly, to the open end swim feeder. On a day like today, you'll note that it's quite still at the moment, but any minute the wind could blow up. Now, for starters, that would be perfect, because the weight of the ground bait itself would actually get the feeder down to the bottom, and I need very, very little lead to keep it on the bottom. Whereas that wind, hopefully it doesn't, but if that wind did get up, like the block end feeder, I'd have to add extra weight. Not because the venue itself is flowing, it's because the surface of the wind and the lake itself actually starts to push. And the more it pushes, the more pressure that puts on the line. So like the block end, I would have had to put an extra little bit of weight on. We'll wait and see how things develop. Hopefully the weather will stay as it is and we won't have to put extra weight on. Another couple of block end feeders there. Well, you can see the difference. One's a small one, one's a big one. As I say, there's so many different applications for swim feeder fishing. On this particular one, you know, there's a little bead at the end, and the cap is fitted by means of some elasticated gut. That's brilliant, because when you actually fill the feeder itself, the cap then bounces back into position and clips on. Another good thing about this elasticated gut is that it acts as a little bit of a shock absorber when you cast. When it's attached to the main line, and you actually start to punch your feeder out, if everything's too abrupt and too sudden, you can quite easily snap somewhere or other. And that just takes out a little bit of the shock resistance. Believe you me, when you're fishing with 2 or 3 ounces of lead on the feeder, there's only probably an ounce on this feeder, it can make all the difference. This small swim feeder, well, it's exactly the same as that larger one, just with far lesser bait carrying capacity. These small swim feeders are ideal for just trying to catch few fish. When you know the going's going to be hard, and you think to yourself, well, 4 or 5 pounds going to win today, so there's no need for me to go over the top and put loads of bait in. These are ideal. Take 15 or 20 maggots. During a 3 or 4 hour match, you probably end up feeding a pint or pint and a half of bait. Now today I'm going to expect to put 3 or 4 pints of bait in, so I won't be using one of these. One thing you must always note when you're fishing with a block end swim feeder is the size of the holes. Now, daft as it sounds, this varies with the temperature of the water. When you buy your standard swim feeder from your shop, it will probably have 3/16 or 9/32 diameter holes, which is ideal for 90% of river fishing. But as the venue goes colder and your baits actually lie more dormant on the base of the bed itself, the bait doesn't actually wriggle out of the holes, it just lies there. You do rely on the current actually forcing the maggots out of the holes. So if you're a smoker, no problem, just get your cigarette and burn the holes a little bit bigger. I don't smoke. So I just carry a range of drills, only 2 or 3 different sizes. Just open the holes out gently. As I said, every time we go swim feeder fishing, applications are different. What else have I got in my box of tricks? 2 more swim feeders. I'll show you this one first of all. Put that one there. This is a cage feeder. Now a cage feeder is exactly the same as an open-ended feeder, but as you can see, it's made out of a wire caging. These are brilliant. I've used these a lot, especially in Ireland. I haven't selected one of these today, and a simple reason. The base of this particular lake is full of boulders and rocks. Now these are great for carrying your bait out, and they're great on retrieval, but the problem is they do tend to hug the bottom. With the standard block open-end feeder, when you start to retrieve, it's like an aquafoil. It actually comes off the bottom and lifts clear of the rocks, therefore no snagging. But with this particular feeder, it just hugs the bottom all the time. There's nothing worse when you're retrieving, especially here. It sort of goes out for about 8 or 9 foot, then it drops to 14 or 15 foot. And if you've got to drag this up a slope of 14 or 15 foot to 8 foot, you're going to snag up left, right and centre. In fact, I fished one match one day and I lost all of these in about a good first hour. Put one of those on, never snagged up once. So it's always worth thinking about that. Like the open ends and the block ends, they come in 2 or 3 different sizes. Who knows, on a day like today, we might catch a fair few fish. Start off with a larger one. If the things didn't appear to be going too well, I'd switch down to a shorter one. Just play it by ear. That is quite a large swim feeder. In its normal state, it carries quite a few maggots. But if you notice, there's a great big piece of lead on the side, and I'll open it, and there's also 2 or 3 coils of lead inside. This is the type of swim feeder you want for throwing a big distance and feeding little. Now if all things don't go well today, who knows, in the last half hour or so I might put this on and see if we can catch 1 or 2 roach when everything else seems to have gone dead. We'll see what happens. Let's set them tackle up and let's get going. Well, as you can see, I've got my gear laid out now. I've set up 2 rods initially. So let's have a look at exactly what we've set up. Let's start at the business end. The hook. Today I'm going to use a size 18 to 1.7 hook length. I'm going to start off with about a 3 foot hook length, but later in the day we might either shorten that or lengthen it. We'll just see how the fish are feeding. The feeder I'm using is the open-ended swim feeder, and this particular rig is the simplest one you can use. All I've done is tied the swim feeder directly to the end of the main line. About 6 or 7 inches above that, I've tied a very small half blood knot loop to which I've tied my hook length. Let me explain why I'm decided to fish this particular method today. As I mentioned earlier, the bottom of the lake is very rough, few rocks, a little bit of gravel and what have you. If this swim feeder does happen to lock in between the 2 rocks, and I do have a fish on, if this was on a sliding link, all that would happen that the fish would pull the line through the sliding link and the feeder would remain snagged. I have 2 options. I can either use what is commonly called a rotten bottom, in other words, the link between the loop for the hook length and the feeder is of a less breaking strain line than the main line, so in actual fact the swim feeder cracks off and I'll still land the fish. Or I can take the easy option, tie direct and hope the fish itself pulls the swim feeder free of the rocks, so I end up with a fish in the net as well. The line I'm using is a 3 pound Maxima. I must stress here that I always use Maxima for ledgering, and the reason is quite simple. It's a very good sinking line, especially on waters like this. I'm going to be fishing 30 to 35 yards out today. As you can see, the wind keeps getting up and dropping. There's nothing worse when you're casting and you lay your line on the water, all that line starts to arc because of the wind. What you want to do is get that line under the water straight away. And for Maxima is brilliant. You just can't beat it for doing just that. Now for the rod and the reel. I'm using an open face reel. This particular model is a Browning 810. It's a nice reel and I do like using it, especially for bigger fish. It's a skirted spool reel, but the beauty of this particular model is that when in fact you do hook a big fish, and being predominantly a match angler, I always lock the base up like so. And once I've locked the base up, I rely on playing fish by either winding backwards or allowing the fish to run freely and pulling the spool round itself. And by actually putting my finger onto this cowling here, I can control the speed that fish is running. In fact, they're ideal for that. Very good make of reel. It's loaded with the 3 pound Maxima, as explained, and if you look closely, it's loaded right up to the rim. I'm fishing, as I mentioned, 30 to 40 yards out, therefore I don't want the line halfway down the spool before I start, because that does impair my casting ability. Always build the line right the way up to the lip of the spool, and it casts very, very freely indeed. The rod, let's just hook my hook onto that bottom ring. This particular model is a tri-cast 11'4" twin tip. It comes in 2 sections, and what I do is I keep the spare tips up the butt. Okay, it might rattle a little bit when I'm catching a fish or two, but that doesn't bother me. More often than not bothers the anglers around me, so we'll leave them exactly where they are. The business end of the rod in itself is the tip section. This is quite a beefy rod up to there, ideal for punching a feeder a fair distance. But the real business is the tip itself. I very rarely use thick tips because I like to see every indication that fish is giving me before it actually takes the bait. And therefore I've made 1 or 2 special tips for this particular rod. The tips are detachable. I just pull on and put off. And depending on the pace of the water itself, I can put either a very fine one or one slightly stiffer. Today, although there's a drift on the surface, the bottom is very still. So I've used a very fine tip, and I should be able to see every slight indication. If you look closely, you can see how fine that actually goes. Just a few thou. And you notice on the end of the tip itself is painted red. And that is ideal for spotting, especially in conjunction with a target board that I'll be mentioning a little bit later on. That's rig number 1. Just drop down there. Rig number 2 is similar. Terminal tackle is slightly different. Well, it's quite a bit different. It's locked. Oops, let's get that feeder down to me. Again, I'm using a size 18 hook to 3 foot hook length and a 1.5 pound breaking strain. This time I'm using the block end swim feeder. If and when I start to catch a few roach, I'm going to switch to this because I'm convinced this is a better method of catching roach. If you look closely, the feeder in this particular instance is joined to the link by means of an American snap. So if I want to take that swim feeder off and replace it with a bigger one or a smaller one, it's just a matter of depressing the clip and sliding the feeder off. Simple. In fact, I'll be using this just before I actually start fishing when I describe exactly how to plumb the depth. Let's just snap that back on for the time being. As you can see here, the link itself is of 2 pound breaking strain and is connected to a swivel. The swivel is then connected to your main line, which is free to run through the swivel itself. To prevent that swivel sliding down onto the hook itself, I have a very small number 8 stop shot. It's not quite as simple as the other method, but it does have its advantages. I've just mentioned I have a 2 pound link on this and a 3 pound main line. In other words, I'm going to use that rotten bottom method. If the fish does snag up, or the swim feeder snags up I would say, that is the first thing that's going to break. Now normally if I'm pleasure fishing, I'm a little bit reluctant to lose a swim feeder. I'd rather lose the occasional fish. But today, for showing the differences, this is what I'm going to do. Now for the rod and the reel. Drop that swim feeder in that tray. That's it. The reel I'm using is a DAM CSI 35. I've always read that as CS1. Again, it's loaded with 3 pound Maxima. It's a skirted spool reel. And once again, the line is built right up to the top of the spool itself. The rod this time comes in, well, 1, 2, 3, 4 pieces. There's a detachable butt, which makes it very convenient for transportation. Quite a stiff butt section there. But this time, the tip and the middle section is quite soft. Because I'm fishing for roach, I'm expecting a little bit more sensitive bite indication and a little bit more of a soft action to the rod to prevent me bumping that particular species. On the tip itself, once again the tips pull out, but this time, instead of the tip pushing over the tip of the rod, it pushes into the tip of the rod. Again, it's a very, very fine tip. In fact, this particular tip is a Shakespeare tip that I've modified to push into a DAM rod. Very, very fine, ideal for spotting those very, very small roach bites. I'll just show you this. I always carry a few spare tips with me, and it'll be an ideal opportunity to show you the difference in their actions. I always carry these tips in that particular little tube. Here I have 4 spare tips, all a completely different makeup. This very fine one is a similar one to that will be using today, but these 3 are quite substantially different. In fact, that one is very stiff indeed. This particular tip I'd use for probably the lower Warwickshire Avon or the Trent, where I'll be expecting to cast 3 or 4 ounces of lead quite away, because those fine tips are just not capable of doing that. These 2 were originally very fine tips, but on occasions I've wanted something that would resist the flow of the water. So being a crude angler at times, instead of make one specifically for the job, I just snapped one of those very fine ones back a few sections. And now, by snapping the one that was originally that length, snapping 2 rings off it, I have a medium stiffness, and the other one, by snapping 3 rings off, I have quite a stiff makeup. In fact, they're ideal. I've got tips there to suit all occasions and all instances. I think the thing to do now is actually mix some bait up. Now the bait I'll be using today will be the normal, maggots, casters, worms and ground bait. But as always, the mixing of the ground bait is very important. So let's get some done. First of all, we'll be using maggots. I won't be using a great deal of maggots. I'll be putting a few in my ground bait mix and I'll be using them on the hook. For some reason the bream over here absolutely adore red maggots. In England we use all colours. Oranges, reds, yellows, whites. For some reason these are the best over here, so that's what we're using. If you notice these particular maggots, they're a nice size. What I do like about red maggots is they're always very active. For some reason they really agitate themselves on the hook. I always plumb for, especially when I'm bream fishing, always plumb for one with a big black spot. And if it's got a big black spot in it, you know it's very fresh. That one, for example, that's only just come off the meat, so to speak. And when they're fresh, they're very soft. There's nothing worse than putting a big hard maggot on and all of a sudden that fish feels that bait is too tough for it and drops it. Always use as fresh a bait as you can possibly get. The main ground bait feed we'll be using is, of course, a caster. This is without a shadow of a doubt the best bait for bream. It lies on the bottom, the fish just move onto it and gobble up all they want. Casters always have to be a mid-brown colour. If they go too dark, they float, and the last thing you want is all your casters popping up to the surface and attracting thousands of seagulls. These are perfect. Nice orange, some of them are white, some of them are just a medium brown. They should be spot on for today. Well, here's a bait I don't normally bring to Ireland, but they do play a major part when you're fishing for bream. In fact, any swim feeder fishing on still waters in England. The pinky, or more often than not the squat. Pinkies and squats are very important for the simple reason they enable you to put live bait into your ground bait and fire it at great distances without creating the ground bait to explode in mid-air. If I was to put a ball of ground bait here, for example, full of maggots, the maggots actually moving in that ball of ground bait would actually cause the ground bait to explode before it hit the water. But with these much smaller pinkies and squats, that doesn't happen. As I said, we don't normally bring them to Ireland, but on this particular occasion, as we're describing some English methods, I'm going to pop a few of those in my ground bait as well. And finally, as a hook bait, where are they? A good old earthworm. That one's not particularly good. These are lovely little worms, dark red, very active. You put a hook in those and they really go berserk. Look at him wriggling away. Now I'm pinching him. That's got to be an attraction for some of these bream. Going mad. One of those on a size 16 or 18 hook with a maggot or a caster, guaranteed to catch us a bream today. Normally I put a few of those in the ground bait as well. Whereas I'm fishing here by myself today, I'm going to leave those out for the time being. Of course, the most important aspect of all your fishing, well, all your bait preparation, is your ground bait. I've always been a little bit meticulous over this, and with feeder fishing you have to be equally as meticulous. Quite a simple mix today. First ingredient, normal brown crumb. This will make up about 30% of the mix. A few liberal handfuls, because we'll be catapulting quite a few balls in a few minutes. The second ingredient, I class this as a binder. It's Van der Nijn's Secret. This gives me a little bit of gluiness, enabling me to catapult as far as I need to. Although I'm only going 30 yards today, I don't want it shattering in mid-air. So a little bit of Secret for today. It's everywhere. A dash of Special. Now you don't have to put this in, I just like it. To be honest, I love the smell. It's a bit of coconut and whatever it is, it's very fine and I don't know, it's just a lovely smell. I just like it. I just like using it. It's a bit of confidence there, I don't know if it does it any good. I just like using this particular ground bait. The final addition, some of this brasem. Evidently it's designed on the continent for attracting bream. I've always caught a fair few bream over here and I've always used it, so I've got no reason to disbelieve that. But only a few teaspoonfuls of that. Mix it up. And add some water. Now, when you're feeder fishing, the last thing you want is for your ground bait to actually solidify in the feeder itself. Ideally, the ground bait you actually put into the swim feeder needs to be fairly dry. And then when your swim feeder actually gets to the bottom, it explodes and leaves the feeder. But you can't catapult dry ground bait very far. So what I normally do is just damp the ground bait initially, so although it binds, it's still very, very dry. And then just put 2 or 3 handfuls to one side, and that then is ready to use for actually putting in the swim feeder. And we won't be using a great deal because the swim feeders aren't very big. So just a few cupfuls, and that'll be ideal to keep us going for a couple of hours. Put that over to one side. Now the rest of the mix needs to be substantially wetter. That will help it to bind, and the additional weight will help it carry through the air as far as we want it. That's already getting quite heavy. Little squeeze. Yeah, that's binding quite nice. The nice thing about these ground baits is, these additives and what have you, normal breadcrumb by itself will catch a lot of fish. But the additives, they give it that little bit of extra body and that little bit of extra fizz. If I was to drop a bit of this in on the bottom, in a few minutes that'll start to bubble and fizz and little bits of oil come off. And that's a real attractor for fish, that is. Now that's about right. One major additive missing now. The hook bait. Yep, spot on. First of all, just a sprinkling of maggots. These are samples for the fish just to take. We're probably using maggot predominantly on the hook today, so it doesn't do any harm just to put a few in your ground bait. As I mentioned earlier, too many of those and you just wouldn't be able to catapult your ground bait too far. Secondly, a liberal helping of casters. Mix all those in. I can't really say exactly what percentage of casters you put in your mix, but normally speaking, in a 5-hour pleasure fishing session on a peg like this, I would expect to probably use 3 or 4 pints. If you're on a real big shoulder fish, obviously I'd expect to use a few more. As I said earlier, I'll put a sprinkling of pinkies in. Not necessary over here, as I brought them with me, it's pointless taking them back. And that now is just about ready to fire out. One thing you've got to be careful is that, given a few minutes, this ground bait itself will probably dry out. So as I've got to rearrange myself now and get my catapults ready, just before I actually put it into the, fire it out onto the lake, I'll probably have to damp it down a bit more. So let's get ready and start to prepare the swim. One of the most important factors before you actually start fishing is to determine exactly how deep your peg is and whether or not there are any vast snags in the peg. There's nothing worse than firing all your ground bait out to find out that you've dropped it on the remains of a tree or God knows what. So the first thing I normally do is, before I actually start to feed the peg, or in fact before I start fishing itself, is to plumb the depth by means of a bomb. Now I showed you earlier that I used a snap link for connecting the feeder. So just for a few seconds I disconnect the feeder and snap on a bomb. Let me explain why I've done that. If you can imagine me casting out into the yonder with a swim feeder, and that swim feeder is sinking to the bottom, what you'll find is, because it's plastic, it tends to go like this, all the way to the bottom. So you don't really know exactly how long it's taken. Well, you know exactly how long it's taken to get to the bottom, but you can't quite determine how deep it is. But by putting a bomb on, you can determine quite accurately how deep it is, simply by counting as the bomb drops. Let me just demonstrate. I'm going to cast this about 30 yards. I'll then drop the rod to the side and count. As soon as the bomb gets to the bottom, the tip drops back. I didn't count on that occasion because of an inkling I was going a little bit too far. This time I'll do exactly the same thing, but I'll count out loud. Right, here we go. The object is to find A, the snags, and B, where the ledge is, and we're going to fish. Right, go. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10-ish. I would imagine that is about 14, 15 foot deep out there. This time I'm going to drop it probably 10 yards closer. And by doing the count again, we can determine if it's any shallower or any deeper. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. There you go, 7. And if I come even closer still, I would imagine that was about 10 or 11 foot deep. This time I'm going to drop it quite close and hopefully it'll be on top of the ledge itself. One, 2, 3, 3. So if you can visualise it, it goes out fairly steadily. I would imagine 7 or 8 foot deep. Then it drops to about 12 or 13 foot deep. And then I would imagine it goes away gradually all the time. What I'm going to do, just to convince myself I'm fishing in the right area at 30 yards, I'm going to go for a big cast and see how deep it does drop off to. Real big cast this time, so we don't crack my bomb off. There we go. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. 13. All I can establish from that is that once I get to about 20 yards, it goes away gradually from me all the time. While it's out there, let's just bring it in to about 30 yards, around there, and let the bomb settle to the bottom. This time I'm going to bring the bomb back fairly slowly. And all I'm doing here is determining if there's any major snags in the peg. I don't mind the occasional boulder and things like that. What you don't want is some big branches or a mussel bed or anything like that. So up to the moment, I mean, you can see it bouncing over those rocks. That's quite clear. In actual fact, that is quite snag-free. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring it in to where that ledge is and try and determine exactly where that ledge is. Now, I think by the way that tip's bouncing there, I'm starting to try and drag the bomb up the ledge. Yeah, it's definitely coming up the ledge there. Yeah, that's on the ledge. And that ledge, I would imagine, about 15 metres out. So reading between the lines, I'm quite safe to fish 25, 35 yards out. It's a nice snag-free bottom, a gentle slope going away from me. But if I can put my feed in fairly accurately, I think the fish should be on in that depth of water. Let's get and put some ground bait in. As I said earlier, that because the time spent plumbing the depth, the ground bait's gone a little bit too dry. I'm just going to damp it down a little bit more to give a bit more body so I can catapult it the required distance. Only needs a dash of water because it's quite saturated. Better. Right. Now when you're making your balls of ground bait up, always ensure they're all about the same size. Because when you start catapulting them a distance, what you find is that, generally speaking, the smaller the ball of ground bait, the further it'll go. Well, I could make a small walnut-sized ball of ground bait and fire it 80-90 yards. If I was to make one an orange size, there's no way I could fire it that far. I'll probably only go 30 yards. But make sure they're all the same size. Today I'm using them sort of tangerine sizes. It's nice and convenient. Another little tip as well, when you're making your balls of ground bait up, always keep a tub of water next to you. Keeps your hands nice and moist, makes you form the ground bait balls far easier. It also gives them like a little wet sheen on the outer surface, and it means they don't break up as they fly through the air. Wet your hands, pinch your ground bait. Looking back a few years when we used to fish the Lough Erne, when there was a lot of fish in the Lough Erne, we used to fish for bream. We used to put about 30 of these in at the start, put big balls, but we used to throw them by hand. And that was always a secret down there. Make them as hard as you possibly can and wet your hands before you throw them in so they go cleanly to the bottom. Now the Severn's a powerful flowing river, but today there's very little flow out there and we don't want to create too much disturbance while making the ball of ground bait actually thunder into the water itself. So the ground bait itself is quite a soft makeup. It's just the binding effect on the outer surface that will carry it to the distance, and as soon as it hits the water it will disappear into a nice puff of ground bait, and all the bits and the ground bait and the maggots and the castles will sink slowly to the bottom and the bream will move in on it, hopefully. That's 4. One more. If this was a competition, and I've got good angles all the way around me, you might find that whoever goes furthest catches most. There's nothing worse than overstretching yourself. For example, I could catapult these balls of ground bait 60 yards. If you notice a little bit of a breeze on it at the moment, there's no way I could get my feeder accurately onto where I put my ground bait. It always pays to put your ground bait a nice, safe, comfortable distance and make sure you ensure you can drop your swim feeder in that spot all the time. So here we go. 5 balls of ground bait, all about the same size. Where's my catapult? Before I actually use it, let's have a look at the catapults I'm using. I use 2 forms of ground bait catapult. First of all is a standard whopper dropper. It's a plastic cup with fabric sides going onto the latex elastic. This is ideal for medium to large balls of ground bait. It's a matter of dropping your ball of ground bait into the cup. Just firm that one up again. Into the cup, pulling the catapult up, and that sits nicely in the cup. Arm at full stretch, drop the arm and pull the ball of ground bait, and away you go. That's about 30 yards, nice comfortable distance. Let's do that again. Make up the ball of ground bait. Ball of ground bait in the cup. Arm at full stretch. Out we go. 2. Probably noticed the wind's got up as I've been ground baiting here. Another quick couple of balls, for the simple reason is a couple of those were a little bit off target due to the wind. This wind highlights the fact that if you do overstretch yourself, the wind actually catching your swim feeder makes it very difficult to get to the position you want to fish. Seagulls are back again. Right, let's see if we can catch a few fish. What you normally find is, let's move this out of the way, because we won't be needing that again. Once you put your initial feed into your swim, it normally takes quite a long while for the bream to actually move in. But if we were to catch roach initially, you would soon know when the bream actually moved in, because the roach would just move out. Because they're quite a boisterous fisher bream. Initially I'm going to start off with the open feeder rod and the fixed link. And I'm going to load the bait, load the hook, sorry, with 2 red maggots. I mentioned earlier, it's a good all-round bait over here, red maggots. In fact, you can't beat them. Do you remember earlier? That's my dry mix. Once I've put a few casters and that in there, and actually cast into the swim, that'll just explode out of the feeder. I'll just keep that in a little tub next to me for convenience. That's all I need. A few more casters, and we're off. I always like to keep this on my left hand side, because when you actually swing your swim feeder to hand, it's so convenient just to drop it there, drop your feeder in and fill it accordingly. I'm going to fill the feeder initially with just crumb and a few casters, and if I think there's a fair few fish out there, I'd probably, let's just cast this. Don't forget, as soon as you cast, sink your line and wait for the feeder to get to the bottom before you actually tighten up. As I was saying, if I think there's a few fish out there, the first thing I'm going to do is not just put ground bait in my feeder, I'm going to actually load it with casters and plug the feeder either end. By doing that, I know I'm getting a lot more feed out to the fish. Although there was quite a bit of feed in the first 4 or 5 balls of ground bait that I did put out. Now the tip has settled back. We've noticed the waves actually causing the tip just to move a bit. So what I'm going to do is just take up the slack and let the pressure of the tip just pull the tip back. Right, I think it'll be a couple of minutes before we actually get a bite. Let me just explain the setup in front of me here. First of all, 2/3 of the way down the rod, I have the rod rest. If you notice, there's a little V in the rod rest, and that is essential when you're ledgering, especially swim feeder fishing. If you try to use a rod rest with a flat bed, the rod itself lies on the flat bed, and when you want to twitch your swim feeder, you can't, because the line is trapped between the rod and the rod rest itself. That little V on the rod rest enables you just to wind on, drag the feeder back, drag it back again, no problem. Also, a little bit further than that, there's a target board. Now the target board is ideal, because when you get those finicky bites, you just line the tip up against one of the lines on the target board, and you can see every indication. To be honest, in Ireland you don't normally need a target board because they take it off the rest. Well, it's a little bit early in the year and some of the bites might be finicky. But in England, a target board can catch you more, can enable you to see more bites than you ever see before. I suspect it might be a few minutes before we actually get a bite. Another good thing is, first 4 or 5 casts, just empty your swim feeder. it's also, that helps build up your peg as well. In actual fact, when you are feeding on a river and you're just using Lough Erne swim feeder, what you tend to do is empty your feeder 4 or 5 times before you actually start, and then you know you've got a better feed down. Now for this second cast, I'm going to fill the swim feeder a little bit more differently. At the moment it's full of casters. I then put the feeder into the ground bait, and that plugs either end. So I've got ground bait at that end, ground bait at that end, and it's full of casters in the middle. So look at my hook bait. Let's put another fresh maggot on. And off we go again. When the wind gets like this, you normally have to end up slightly casting up from where you want to, exactly only a few yards upstream from where you want to fish, and the wind will actually carry your feeder over your feed. Right, that's just dropping, and the tip should drop back any second now to let us know we're on the bottom. There we go, it's dropped back. Tighten up, make sure all your line's under the water, but this Maxima does sink well, and wait for the indication. It'd be nice if you could catch a few bream. The thing about fishing for bream is you need to be patient. I remember Ivan Mark saying to me, there's nothing worse than sitting there getting bites all day and striking it every time your tip moves. A bream, once he decides to have that bait, will have it. It's just a matter of making sure that he's got it properly. The worst thing you can do is every indication on the tip is strike, because you end up going in and out, missing more bites. Ivan's old trick was to put the rod on the rod rest and just sit on his hands. And when the tip actually went right round, like it has there, he knew he'd hook every bite. This is the first fish of the day. It looked like a bream bite, but I'm convinced it's only a roach. You can always tell roach when they're coming in. They seem to zigzag about here, there and everywhere. It's not a bad little roach actually, this. Feels something about 7 or 8 ounces. And if that start continues, by the end of the day we could have a few fish. Going to my left. Oh yes, a lovely, beautiful roach this is. Woohoo! Oh yeah, I don't believe that. Well, we're lucky enough. I think there's a few fish out there, so that didn't come too much as a disappointment. Well, sure, in a match condition I'd have been furious. In fact, the air would definitely have turned blue. It's one good thing about pleasure fishing. It doesn't matter if you lose the occasional fish. A double maggot seems to be doing the trick at the moment. 2 casts, 1 bite, no fish on behind. Right, let's get out there again. When you're actually fishing with a swim feed, always make sure everything's in line. Rod behind you in a straight line, everything straight. Sink your line. Wait for the feeder to hit the bottom before you tighten up. That's it. Take the slack up, drop the feeder back on the rest. Now that could have been a liner. The tip itself actually went round and come straight back. It's either a very small roach or a line bite. And when I say a liner, what's happened is that there's a lot of fish out there. I know there is now, because I mean we've only just started and there's bites straight away. The fish, instead of actually taking the bait, actually colliding with the line, and that's often a good sign. But saying that, I have fished matches where I've had liners all day and never actually caught a fish. They're just not in a feeding mood. They're just swimming around and rolling on top of your tackle. On days like that, you end up foul hooking more than you actually catch. Believe me, there's nothing worse than a big foul hook bream in a... It's going again. Come on. Definitely another roach. You can always tell, they just nick it. And... So the beauty about these swim feeders is that at least they do avoid the snags. There's quite a few rocks over there, and roach do tend to jag about near the bottom. Once you get them off the bottom, they're okay, but the problem here is that with that ledge dropping off suddenly, it's difficult to get them right off the bottom and over that ledge, so you have to hold your rod up fairly high and keep them coming. It's not as big as that one I lost, but nevertheless worth netting. Apart from the fact I got my ground bait catapult tangled up, that was quite good. Beautiful condition fish, these roach. Absolutely gorgeous. Look at that. That fish has never been caught. Beautiful red fins. Notice a black tinge to the edge of the fin. Beautiful lateral line. Superb. There we go. Look at the way he's battered those maggots. What a lovely fish. I get the impression at the moment there's obviously more bream than roach out there, and to be honest I should be fishing with the other rig. I'm going to persevere with this for a few minutes because I want to get as many casters into the swim as I possibly can. So again, filling with caster, plugging with ground bait, and let's get it into the swim. Bail arm over. That wind's really blowing now. Out we go. Get the line down. Just wait for it to hit the bottom. Back come the gulls. Right, that's it. Now this is where target board really comes into its own. Well, having the rod on the rod rest and the tip in front of the target board, as we've got these ripples and little waves and that, it's often difficult to actually pick up the bite unless you've got a good background. Now this target board has two sides. This particular side I've got 3 white vertical lines. So by lining the tip up with those 3 lines, you can see every indication. It's only got to move an inch and it jumps from one line to the next. So we don't normally have to use these in Ireland, but in England they're a godsend. Now that's going already. That is definitely a roach. Just keep the line to them. There's a load of roach out there. And you can notice, line it up with the middle line, and within a few minutes, the fish taking the bait, there it goes, straight across. Oh, how can you miss a fish like that? Impatience. Oh dear me. He's really battered me bait. Another 2 maggots. If you want to catch a roach, you're probably better off using a single maggot. Really, I want to try and catch some bream or even a bigger roach. So I'm sticking with a bigger bait for the time being. In fact, if the roach get to become too much of a nuisance, I might even put a worm on. Although the worm doesn't really pay off here this time of year. A little bit later on it does. Let's go through that little sequence again. Onto the rod rest. Line it up with the tip, taking up the slack line as soon as your feeder gets to the bottom. You noticed how long it takes a feeder to get to the bottom as opposed to that ledger when I plumbed it earlier on? Twice as long in this case. Right. Is it lined up on the board? Yeah, there's a fish there already. Really playing with it out there at the moment. Really playing with it. Yeah, got this one. You can really pick out every indication with this target board. Well, it's only a small fish, this is. 3 or 4 ounce, I would imagine. Under match conditions, you'd probably be ringing this in a little bit quicker, because by now I've probably stepped up to a slightly bigger hook. This is the time when they always come off. I don't know why it is, just as you tend to show them the landing net, they tend to flick the heads and away they've gone. Ooh, now that is amazing, that's a bigger roach than I thought. That's a fair little fish, that. I like peas in a pod, gorgeous fish them. Look at that, right lip hooked. In fact, I probably struck a little bit early on that one because the maggot's not even damaged. I would imagine that's, what, 7 or 8 ounce? Cracking fish. Quite enjoying this. Let's put the maggot on, get out there quickly. In fact, what I'm going to do this time is, last cast on this, I'm going to change rods. I'm going to go on the block end feeder, because I think we'll probably catch roach a little bit better on that than this. Because this particular swim feed is locked, in other words it can't slide up the line, they're probably feeling the weight of that swim feed a little bit too quickly. And that's why I've missed a few bites. But with a sliding link you probably get a more definite bite indication. And also I'm going to hold the rod rather than put it down. When the bream moving, you can just put your rod on the rest and wait for them to take the lot. I mean, the rod should go off the rest. While the roach are there, they seem to be coming in, shredding the maggot, and off they go. Just take the slack up. It's really blowing a gale now. We're quite lucky, I'm relatively sheltered down the edge here. There's some really white horses out there now. Yeah, it's on again. Loads of fish out, isn't it? Unbelievable. Beauty about this method, it's not difficult. I mean, it's probably the most simple method to use, but you still have to do it half right to make the most of it. So in a pleasure fishing situation, a nice lazy day's fishing, you can't beat this. To be honest, if this was under match conditions, with this many roach in front of me, I'd probably start feeding closer and closer and closer, and eventually trying to catch a few fish on the pole. Because you're not going to win really in a big matching island swim feeder fishing for roach. So still very enjoyable. Oh, thank you very much. The hook's dropped out already. Let's have a little dabble with this other rod. There's only roach there at the moment. I just want to see, who knows, they might want a bit of ground bait today, but I just want to see if they do prefer the block end. Just take this bomb off that I plumb the depth with. Typically unorganised, can't find my swim feeder. There it is. This wind gets up, your hands get very cold, and it's always difficult to do these fiddly little jobs like connecting your swim feeders back on. That's it. Off and running. Another thing you can do if you're missing a fair few bites is shorten your hook length. I mean, the fish are obviously homing in on a feed at the moment, so I would imagine if you put a short hook length on, you'd catch as many. This is one advantage of barbless hooks. They come straight out of keep nets. Sometimes. Spot the deliberate mistake. Whenever you're feeding a block end feeder, filling a block end feeder, always put your hook bait on first. Because by the time you've got your hook bait on, your maggots have all come out. You'll notice this rod in the tip is quite a bit softer than the other rod. And with roach you should get a really good bite indication. And as the actual feeder itself is sliding on the line, what you will find is that they won't feel the resistance of the feeder as quick. And we should get some much more definite, quicker bites. Take all the slack up. For some reason or other, it's taken quite a while to actually get a bite on this rig. I do suspect the roach actually want a bit of ground bait, so no, there's a bite. Yeah, we got one. So after this fish, providing I get it in, I'm going to change back to my original rig, back on the ground bait and caster. With a little bit of luck, we might be able to pull a couple of bream in. That's not a bad roach again. None of these roach appears to have spawned, so they're obviously on the way up to the spawning grounds. They're perfectly fit and very slimy. What you notice, once a fish has spawned, it tends to clean itself in the reeds, and the scales become very rough, and all the slime is, well as a result, all the slime being wiped off. They're very, very strong, very hardy fish in this loch. They have... Oh, he's snagged up on me. No, he hasn't. It's quite a nice roach, this. I've had roach over £1 in this loch. In fact, round at Trury one day I had a lovely net of roach. Nobody else caught them. I was fishing worm for bream and I kept getting these big roach instead. Oh, lovely. Absolutely immaculate fish these are. With this gorge up. I don't need it, fell out in the net. Right, let's change back to that original rig. Let's see if we can get ourselves a couple of bream. The roach obviously got an affection for them red maggots at the moment. There might be a few bream out there, although I suspect there's not a great deal because they would push the roach out. Bit of a change bait this time. I'm going to use a maggot. In fact, better still, I'm going to put 2 maggots on and a caster. Burst that one. Best combination for doing this in actual fact is putting the caster on first and the 2 maggots. I'm doing it the other way around. I'm putting a maggot, then a caster, then a maggot. Fill the feeder up, 2 casters, plug with ground bait. Come on, let's have a bream. Wind is dropping. When that wind gets up, it gets quite cold actually. As I've got 3 baits on this time, I can put on my rest. Take the slack up. Also, I'm going to find myself another ball of ground baiting. We find after a couple of hours fishing that if the fish haven't moved on in numbers, especially the bream, it quite often pays just to top your feed up a little bit. I usually put a couple of balls in halfway through a match. Yep, it's gone round that time. Whoa, yes. Definitely a bream. Yes, bit bigger than I thought, this one. It's not a bad fish. Whoa, dear me, it's really going. Be careful of these rocks here. Whoa, he's taking some line. Come on, my beauty. There he is. See his fin? Oh, you bugger. And I shouldn't swear on camera. Sorry, but here we go. The thing about breams, you always get the head out of the water before you net them, because that last surge. Beautiful. A few more of these, and we have a right good net of fish. What a dark fish that is. Nearly black he is. Imagine about £2.5. Might even go £2.12. He would never have got off. He's really in his lip. Looks quite an old fish as well. Still smooth. It's not ready for spawning yet. Another few weeks, I would imagine. Yeah, there's one there again now. Look at that bite. Go on, my beauty. Take it round. Whoa, solid. Tell you what, if you do pegs like this every time, you'd win a load of money. It's good fish, this. Apart from the fact it's snagged up. See if it swims out. The problem with all these boulders, you see, when you hook a big fish and they come in slow on the bottom, the feeder can catch between. Now, I'm quite lucky on this particular rig. I'll give it a few seconds, hopefully the fish will swim away and pull that feeder out of the snags. He hasn't yet. Patience, see if he does it. Still on because the tip's still going. Look at that. Now, another second or so, see if he swims out. Still on, look at that. Tip's still going round. Come on, swim out of that snag. That's a problem, trying to get him up that blooming ledge. This is where we all fall in. Remember watching Barry Fulford do this one down the Severn. He hooked a barbel and he ran into a snag and you could feel it seesawing on the snag, and he did it for 40 minutes. I haven't got the patience to do that. 40 minutes he did it for, and eventually it swam out. Ended up winning the match for £44. It was a big match as well, an 8,000 pegger. It's the old BAA annual, and everybody in the country used to say, there we go. Patience is a great thing. God, if this was match down, it was the last fish on the whistle. You think all your Christmases had come at once. I'm not going to let him go down again. But he thought he was off and away, didn't he? No second chance for you, pal. You're in the basket. Yeah. Oh dear, oh that's a good fish. I think that's the biggest one so far. He's not far off £3. Still playing with it now. I think they're starting to get a bit finicky. Artifact's a bit ominous out there. I think I'm going to get wet in a few minutes. Yeah, we're in again. Mind you, I'm going to make this the last fish. Bit of luck, I'm going to pack up before it really pours down. Get him over that ledge. Ooh, come on my beauty, come on. I'm having second thoughts about this fish. I don't think it is a bream. Well, it's scurrying along the bottom. Oh, I don't believe it. Perch. I'm not netting him. Come on. Well, that's it. It's unusual, really. We've only caught the one perch. Quite a prehistoric looking species. Look at this back fin, it's quite sharp. In fact, when you're fishing over here and you're catching quite a few of these, you can end up hurting your hand quite a lot with their fins actually sticking into you. One thing about perch, when they move into the swim, almost certain that most other species have moved out. I think that's just an ideal end to a perfect day's fishing. I hope you've learnt a little bit about the swim feeder today. The one big plus about swim feeder fishing is that for fishermen that are a little bit irregular with their feeding, it does mean that you are feeding your swim all of the time. Every time you bring your swim feeder in, you fill it with either ground bait, casters, maggots and chuck it out again. There's a bit more feed going into your peg. So building and building and building your swim all the time. And I think that was evident by the fact that when we started this morning, the fish we were getting were roach. They were coming in, screaming at the bait, and we was getting a roach a chuck at one stage, but the fish didn't, the bream themselves didn't move in. And all of a sudden, as we built the peg up and catapulted a few more balls of ground bait out, those bream started to move in. And once those bream moved in, everything else went. And you notice when the bream actually moved in, you could catch them on anything, maggot, worm, caster, nothing else to take the bait at all. I've had a fantastic day's sport. I don't know what I've got in the net. I would imagine anything between 25 and 35 pounds. I'm the world's worst at predicting weights. You ask anybody on the match circuit, ask anybody what I've got and I'll say, oh, Andrew's got 10 or 15 pounds. If I say I've got 5 or 6 pounds, it ends up at 15. Today, well, anything between 25 and 35. Let's have a look at the fish and put them back. Be careful with your net here because it's quite rocky. I think there might be a little bit over 30 pounds there. I think we've got about 8 or 9 good bream. A fair few roach, lovely fish. There they go. Yep. All off safely. Except for that bream there. Come on then. That's this, off he goes. The will be locked, they'll be there for a few weeks. And the big matches take place. What a fine end to a fine day.